Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hello, everyone. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about an aspect of World War I that, if you don't know anything about World War I, or it's still a black hole according to what you know about history, I think this episode will be interesting and help you make a lot of sense of it. This is especially true if you're in the United States, because if you're from Europe or the Middle East, you're likely taught much more about World War I in school. And beyond that, you know that World War I has to do with your nation's origin. If you're in the former domains of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Ottoman Empire, your country basically came into existence after World War I and has to do with treaties that were drawn up then. If you're from countries that existed beforehand, like Germany or France or England, World War I had absolutely devastating impacts on your country and permanently altered it from what it was before. There are even historical periods in Europe that have to do with World War I, and it was so seismic that it completely changed everything. One term that historians like to use is called the long 19th century, which is a period from after the French Revolution until World War I, and describes what's happening in Europe. The term the long 19th century acknowledges that things are changing after the late medieval period, where the power and idealism of a monarchy no longer hold sway. You see representative government appearing, but there are still colonies. There are still old institutional structures from the past that exist in the modern period. World War I changed all that. Now, if you're from the United States, then World War I is hard to describe. All right, there were treaties that happened. Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. I at least know that name, even if I don't know who he was or what he did. That pulled a lot of European countries into war for reasons I don't understand, due to treaties they had to uphold. But why did they stay so close to treaties that it resulted in millions of deaths and they still kept fighting? What was happening? And moreover, for Americans whose family members fought in World War I and died, and I have a great-great-uncle, I believe, who fought in World War I, it might seem like it was a sacrifice with no real bearing on the United States. That has to do with a question I received from a listener, and that's going to be the topic of this discussion. Here's the question from Alan Baker. I recently found out that my maternal grandfather died on October 10th, 1918, at the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The little I've heard since is that he was in the 82nd Division, or 328th Infantry. And it may have something to do with the Lost Battalion and the gap between the 1st and 26th Division, and I'll explain what all that means later on. My big question is this. From what I've read, it seems like there was little or no reason for my great-grandfather and his brothers in arms to have been thrown into this fight. Was there a reason? And if so, was it justified? It may be that his life was extinguished for almost no reason, and only 1 month before the end of the war. If you could clarify the reasoning behind the offensive and details about what they were doing there and why, I would love to know more. All right, well, thank you for the question, Alan, and it's a very good one. World War I is confusing. I studied it as part of my research field for the Ottoman Empire, and I still get confused by it a lot too, and I have to look up details about it and put things in place to make sense of it. Well, what I'm going to be doing in this episode is to be referencing a book called The Yanks Are Coming by Harry Crocker that describes the American involvement in World War I. The book tries to justify why America wasn't just incidental or on the sidelines of World War I, but was critically responsible for Allied victory. If you're not from the United States, well, apologies, this is a little bit of an American-centric episode. But if you want to understand the war from all sides, hopefully this will be useful for you. And there are many historical accounts of World War I and many interpretations of what it meant, so I'm sure there are accounts that disagree of the importance of U.S. involvement in the war, or books that say it was a colossal mistake for the United States to enter. One is bluntly called America's Greatest Blunder, The Fateful Decision to Enter World War I by Burton Yale Pines, which came out about 6 years ago. So if you want an alternate account about the United States and World War I, then there's a book for you. So let me jump over now to the Harry Crocker book and try to summarize it pretty well, because I think it answers the question that you're going for. If Americans know much about World War I, they would say that when America entered, they probably entered too late to claim much credit for it, because they didn't really get into active combat until 1917, and then the war ends in 1918. Some say that there wasn't a compelling national interest to enter the Great War. Our land wasn't being threatened, and we weren't threatened by conquest. Worse, our intervention allowed Britain and France to force on Germany an unjust peace that made the rise of Adolf Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party inevitable. If we'd stayed out of the war, the argument goes, Europeans would have been compelled to make a reasonable negotiated peace, and then we could have avoided World War II. Part of America's disillusionment with World War I can be blamed on Woodrow Wilson. After he preached strict neutrality and campaigning on how his diplomacy kept us out of the war, Wilson changed his tune in April 1917 and said that the United States had to enter the war because he said the world must be made safe for democracy, though that was never really the issue. He embraced the idea, even if he didn't invent it, that this was a war to end all war, an expectation that disappointed. Some thought of the war in terms of the cynical lost generation. Men like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald getting drunk in post-war Europe, criticizing their former ideals and thinking that words like glory, honor, courage, or hallow were obscene. But instead, some argue that American intervention was decisive in the Anglo-French victory, and it's a victory that deserves celebrating. Even if it was the case that the Second Reich was not as evil as the Third, and Germany's initial decision to back its ally Austria-Hungary against Serbia was justified, its ambition to dominate the continent through force of arms and its brutal occupation of France and Belgium was in no less need of rejection. The war shaped the lives of some of America's greatest soldiers and statesmen, including George Patton, Douglas MacArthur, Dwight Eisenhower, and Harry Truman, and was hugely consequential. It was in a lot of senses the war that made the modern world. It was a war that set the boundaries of the modern Middle East out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, and it was the war that saw the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which held together Middle Europe. It was a war that rewarded nationalism, which had been the war's original cause. It ended the Second Reich in Germany and witnessed the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. It was one of the first major wars that moved into the skies and under the seas. Infantry officers wore wristwatches to coordinate attacks. Trench coats became a military fashion accessory. And it was the collapse of old ideals that helps explain what has become the popular view of the First World War. It was senseless, a stupid struggle, and a perfect example of the absurdity of war. Well, the casualty lists were definitely long. The victory that was won was horribly mismanaged. Part of the problem is maybe a misguided sense of nostalgia. Before World War I, it said, Europe was a graceful place that sunned in the warmth of Western civilization and its empires and global dominance and booming economies and social progress. And if the First World War hadn't happened, then maybe Europe would have carried on in some sort of blissful state, the Belle Epoque, as it was called before World War I, progressive but stable and peaceful, and no terrible casualties would have occurred. Norman Angell, who published The Great Illusion in 1910, believed that Europe's international trade and modern industrial economies meant the abolition of war, because conquest now brought no economic advantage, and this argument has been repeated many times. But many others argue, and I think this is true, that the order in Europe that was essentially crafted after the Napoleonic Wars was inevitably going to break down due to the complex web of alliances, and something had to break the old system. And it's tragic that warfare happened on the scale that it did in World War I, but it's hard to imagine there could have been some sort of peaceful, negotiated new order that would have pleased all parties without something like this happening and breaking it down. Well, let's jump ahead to American involvement in World War I. The United States declared war on April 6, 1917, against Imperial Germany. The reason it did this is because of actions that Germany undertook in 1917. It seemed to have the upper hand with Russia, and Britain and France was low on credit. Germany decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare and starve Britain into surrender and prevent the United States from supplying it. Even though German high command realized that sinking American-flagged ships would bring the United States into war. One of the tipping points was Germany making a secret offer to help Mexico regain territories lost in the Mexican-American War. This offer was found in the Zimmerman telegram, which was intercepted by British intelligence. News of this outraged Americans, just as U-boats started sinking American merchant ships. This all led to Congress voting to declare war on Germany. Well, it was quite another thing for America's armed forces to wage it. Wilson's former policy of strict neutrality and pacifist politicos who believed that arming for war could provoke Germany helped ensure that America's warfighters were short of nearly everything. And this included men. There weren't long lines of people filling the recruiting station like there were after the Pearl Harbor attack. Neither the president nor Congress had any idea how many men might be needed. Some thought the United States only needed to supply aid and perhaps some naval support to the embattled Western allies. Military delegations from Britain and France soon stopped such ideas of minimalism. The war machine in Europe needed men, and America was far wealthier in young men, even if they weren't yet uniformed, than it was in military material. The regular army was 127,000 strong, backed by 67,000 National Guardsmen in federal service, and another 100,000 National Guard troops controlled by their respective governors. In terms of numbers, the U.S. was on par with the military strength of Portugal. In terms of supplies and training for trench warfare, and modern warfare in general, the American army was barely prepared at all. It was better suited to fighting past wars, the Apaches or Filipino insurgents of the 19th century, than it was fighting the new modern warfare of artillery and machine guns being waged in Europe. France and Britain didn't want 100,000 Americans to join the Western Front. They wanted 1 million men, for starters, and they wanted them quickly before the German armies crashed through the Western Front. And since Russia had been pacified, soldiers were moving from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. This apparently modest army would fight its first offensive battle in the Battle of Cantigny. By doing so, America announced to the world that it was a military power to be reckoned with. Given the task of forming and leading this army was the newly appointed commander of the American Expeditionary Force, Major John J. Pershing, called Blackjack, a veteran of the Indian Wars and the Spanish-American War, and most recently commander of the campaign against Pancho Villa. Pershing was charged with building a division that could embark for France in June of 1917. Wilson and Pershing agreed on another item. American troops wouldn't be fed piecemeal or amalgamated into the French or British armies, but remain separate and distinct under their own officers. This was the military corollary of President Wilson's insistence the United States had entered the war not as an allied power, but as an associated power. To Wilson, there was still such a thing as a man too proud to be an ally. Although there was a wave of enlistments in the days immediately after Congress declared war, to put a sufficient number of men in uniform and behind rifles, the Wilson administration resorted to conscription. The president signed the Selective Service Act into law on May 18, 1917. By the end of the war, the Army had more than 3 million men, 2 million of whom had been drafted. Not all American soldiers were created equal. A shocking number were deemed unfit for service, about a third, but those who eventually landed in France had an incredible effect on the population. To them, the American soldier was big, confident, and what he lacked in training, he made up for in élan, something that the French could appreciate. The first to arrive were Pershing, his staff officers, and a number of sergeants and others, a total of 187 men, including Lieutenant George S. Patton and a former race car driver named Eddie Rickenbacker, now a sergeant and a chauffeur for the general. Pershing met with General Philippe Pétain, the new commander-in-chief of the French army, who had just averted disaster on the Western Front. In April 1917, his predecessor, General Robert Nivelle, had launched a massive offensive, deploying 1.2 million soldiers and 7,000 artillery pieces, with which he promised to break the German line within 48 hours. More than 3 weeks later, he had gained 70 square miles at the cost of 187,000 men. He achieved no breakout, no rush to victory, but a long-suffering stalemate with mutiny flaming through the French divisions. Nivelle was relieved, and on the day when France had to choose between ruin and reason, as Charles de Gaulle wrote, Pétain was promoted. Pétain was a friend of the common soldier and had been an open critic of Nivelle's plan. He believed in fighting firepower with firepower and protecting the lives of his men. He made a personal inspection of the front lines, visiting nearly every battalion, reassuring troops he wouldn't waste their lives in futile offenses, and would clean up the trenches, give them more generous leave, and also promised them that help, in the form of American doughboys, was on the way. American troops were eager to meet the challenge, though some of the initial arrivals had never even fired their weapons. Pershing wouldn't be rushed, though. The men had to be trained, and he was unimpressed by the British and French instructors available to him, and he thought that they taught tactical defeatism. He thought instead that American soldiers should be riflemen and fight a war of mobility, not hide in trenches, ducking artillery rounds. Through the fall and into the winter, a harsh one for which they're unprepared, kind of like a valley forge, they trained for a war of rifle-led firepower. Many of the 1st Division began moving into a quiet sector of frontline trenches in northeastern France on October 21st,